Hi everyone, welcome to the second webinar of today, part of the Collectors Conference GB Stamps online event at allaboutStamps.co.uk. So this session is from Maurice Buxton, who's with us, and we'll be looking at King George VI, postal history and stamps on cover, really covering the periods 1937 to 1955. So lots of stamps and covers to entertain us and inform us. So I will now hand over to Maurice if he can share his screen, and we'll have Q&As at the end. So if you do want to have, if you do have any questions, please just use the Q&A box at the bottom or the chat facility. Okay, so over to you, Maurice.
Okay. Let's see. Right. There you go. Okay. I thought it would be good to have something a bit more modern than the Victorian period in this. So this is one of my numerous collections on the usage and rates of King George VI era. Brief introduction there. I started this about 20 years ago now, and I thought, yeah, this will be something more stamp oriented, rather than just pure postal history. And it'll be quite small, quite compact. It might make about 150 pages, due for a display. It's now, the stuff that's written up is probably closer to 1,000 pages, and there are still looking around boxes of material waiting to be put onto pages. So all in all, that wasn't a great bit of estimating. So this is only going to be there for a sort of brief introduction to some of the aspects of the area within the 40 minutes. There are 60 basic stamps, so probably can't get all of them in, but there are about 120 items here. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone and give you an idea of what's sort of available to collect in this area. Right. When you talk about stamp usage, you probably think of a stamp paying the rate it was issued for. I always think this is quite a nebulous rather description, because a lot of stamps were just issued for a variety of things. Okay, for example, the 1939 shilling brown, a humble little stamp. What was the rate it was issued for? Well, at the time, probably the main rate it was paying was the top weight inland parcel rate, which is a slightly unusual thing. Mainly, it was just there for general use. The most common rate you see it used for is the 47 to 52 Zone B Airmail letter rate. They're going to FDR's widow in America. But obviously that wasn't what it was specifically issued for at the time, because this is 8 years later. And there are other rates. You could also use it for paying airmail printed papers, triple rate in the same era, and in the next era, it paid double rate. So you've got quite a range of different possibilities. And you've also got what you might call accidental totals that make up a solo usage. So for the shilling again, that one is 9p rate to Trinidad, by sea to New York, then by air from New York to the West Indies, plus 3D registration, which is not the thing you would issue a stamp for specifically. And again, there you got combination of airmail to Egypt plus express, or you got weird things like that where somebody's taken an envelope and used it as a parcel label and added registration on top. So all in all, you've got quite a range of things. Most of the George VI stamps are actually particularly rare on cover. Some of them are rarer as solos, though. This is one that's actually probably the only low value stamp below the 2 and 6p that's actually quite difficult to find on cover in any form. It was issued for the 1947 for the new second step parcel rate And the point is, 11pence is such a odd sort of value that it didn't get used for many other things. There are other possible solo uses here. That one's on a sort of high printed papers rate for the Hawker Siddeley Review going to Holland, and that's on the registered airmail to Austria. But that's quite an unusual stamp to find. And then, of course, there are the occasional stamp that are pretty common on cover as such, just used as a makeup value. But trying to find them as a solo use is really hard. This is probably the hardest of the lot. The 1951 new colours, the Halfpenny Pale Orange. Why was that so hard to find? Well, the main reason was by 1951, there were hardly any halfpenny postal rates left. You would see it on certificates of posting sometimes, but if you want it on a cover or a posted item, then articles for the blind is like the only one you can get. Articles for the blind tend to be extremely hard to find from any era. That's another slightly surprising one, because they issued a set of 6 for the postal century, they're 6 values from halfpenny to threepence. But 5 days before it was due to be issued, they bunged the rates up. And so the 3 halfpenny value, which would have been probably the most used as the former inland letter rate, now became slightly adrift. There were very few things you could use it for on its own. That is one of the few you could use it for, which is the second step inland printed papers. If you're wondering what the Chartered Society of Massage and Medical Gymnastics is, it's now the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. They changed it a few years after this, probably because they got fed up everybody laughing at the name. Another thing I quite like is what I call single value usages, where you've got the whole rate paid by one stamp. So you got there a nice little block of 12 of the 9p on an airmail to Kenya. You got another 12 random tuppence halfpennies there on double rate to America. You can go up to, there's one for 15 pennies on an airmail to Canada. The record I've got so far is 40, although that's on a philatelic cover, so maybe didn't count what I'm trying to put in here. Right. High values on the cover. Depends what you define as a high value. 2 and 6p stamps are actually quite common on cover, and the 5 bobs aren't that hard to find either. The 10 shilling values are harder, and you may have seen, if you're familiar with the GBPS journal, that there was an article a while back which highlighted that although the 10 shilling dark blue is the most highly catalogue value as a used stamp off cover compared to the 2 later 10 shillings, it's actually rather easier to find it on cover. And the reason there is probably because wartime air rates were so much higher that you're more likely to find a small cover that was preserved and still has the 10 bob stamp on it. That's an example. The 4 and 6p per half ounce rate to Australia going by 2 Oceans, which has a 10 bob, 2 and 6p and a shilling to make up. The later ones, that's, post-war, going to South Africa, and you've got a 10 bob stamp there, which is 10 times the shilling rate. You've got the 10 bob festival, which is 21-fold 6p printed papers rate. So it's actually quite, the rates had dropped quite a bit, so you didn't need a high value stamp. Pound values, you will note they were all issued in a period about 3 years post-war. So they are even harder to find. They're the ones that are really extremely hard to find on cover at all. That is one I only got a few months ago, and it's the first pound arms on cover have been able to get hold of. So that's a bit of a stroke of luck, shall we say. But you can see it's a 70-second step rate to sample, so it's quite a high rate. That's one I've had for a while, which is the Pound Festival. And again, you see that's the sort of thing at this point, the only thing where the rates were high would tend to be air parcel rates. Unfortunately, parcel tags aren't often kept, so you don't get to see the stamps that often. You can also get some really heavy packets, which have spectacular frankings with these things. That's my highest yet. It's a 247th step airmail rate for a packet that's over £7.5. What the hell was in it? I don't know. I suspect it must have been metal to justify that amount of weight. And the only thing I can think of is going to a museum in America, a Museum of Modern Art in New York. So the only thing I can think of, it must have been something like a printing plate. But as you see, 10 bob was the highest value at the time, so we got 30 of the things plastered all over it. It's the sort of cover that would often have had the stamps soaked off, so it's a bit lucky to get one that's survived. Commemoratives. There are a number of issues throughout the reign. These are almost always issued for a specific rate. So there's your twopence halfpenny stamp for inland letters, or your shilling stamps in the post-war sets paid the airmail letter rate. That's a slightly tatty cover, but it's I rather like it because it was posted from the Olympic Park by a member of the American Olympic team back home. So it's quite nice to have that one. Turned up in a mixed lot, so which is another nice thing to find with these. And there's a nice little fourpenny stamp which pays the European or local service rate. Sometimes people wonder if a commemorative on cover is philatelic or not, because there were definitive stamps available at the same time. Why wouldn't you use those? The answer, quite simply, is that the commemoratives replaced the definitives whilst they were on issue. So there's, you've got one paying a 5 times rate on Airmail. I've made it up with 5 separate 1 and threepennies, which is a novel way to do it, but the threepenny stamp at the time was the victory issue, so that's what they used. And an example there for the UPU, a few years later. So the threepenny and the sixpenny stamps were replaced by the commemorative issue. That is the obvious exception to the commemoratives were issued for a specific rate. That was just a money-making thing as part of the general Empire Omnibus set. So like all the other pound values, it's really hard to find on cover. You do sometimes find it on these mailbag tags, which aren't actually parcel tags, though they're often described as such. They were added to sealed bags of mail addressed to post offices abroad to say what the value of the stamps in the packet was, to help with the accounting. That's one that actually shows the sort of thing. It was white for letter mail and yellow for printed papers. Commemoratives often had surprisingly extended issue periods. That was the first commemorative of the reign, the coronation issue, one of the very first few stamps of the reign, in fact. And that's the sort of thing that's nice to find if you can get hold of it. It's a first day of issue, but a commercial one. But the penny halfpenny definitive wasn't ready for quite a while. It wasn't issued until the end of July. So the coronation stamp was left on issue for quite a while. So you get some pretty late users. That's a 30th of August one, for example. And the other thing that that's been on issue a very long time was the Olympic issue. The problem there was that they severely overordered the stamps, the threepenny, sixpenny to shilling, for the foreign rates because they thought they were going to need a lot more than they had. So at the end of the Olympics, they were left with a ton of these things, and the only thing they could do was, well, the quote was, the stores department will have to keep pumping the things out until we've got rid of them all. That's the latest commercial use I found. Again, it's a slightly tatty cover, but it's well into December. I believe the 24th November, so roughly, was the notice in the post office circular saying, okay, finally we got rid of all these big stamps. I won't do too much on this, but one obvious way if you're doing usages is to collect as many different combinations for a particular rate as you find. You do get into what's known as the combinatorial explosion, mathematically speaking. There's only a few different combinations for low rates, but when you get up to something like 1 threepence, well, it depends what you include and whether you include stamps from different issues on the same cover, how you calculate it. There's at least 1,000 different possibilities on that, and if you calculate the unlikely combinations of stamps from different eras, it can get even more. I mean, that's what looks like the basic, obvious way to do it, which is a shilling and a threepenny stamp, because they never at the time issued a shilling and threepence stamp. But there are lots of possibilities, as I say, coming onto screen as you see them now. Mixtures of mid values, some with lots of stamps on the time, a 4, 5, 6 combination, 2 booklet panes as a combination, stamps with the previous reign, use of commemoratives, uprates on postal stationery, things like that, with just, well, plastered with low value stamps. I think I've got about 120 different combinations of this. I try to, it's just out of curiosity to try and pick up as many as I can. But as I say, there are probably well over 1,000 you could have at least, many of which you're probably not going to find because it's quite likely nobody ever put that combination on the cover in the first place. You may have seen a few stamps with a few covers earlier on with mixed frankings. Stamp sets don't usually get issued all at once, well, not definitive sets anyway. Usually they're sort of dribbled out a bit at a time, so it takes quite a while for them to be issued. I mean, the George V stamps were, the last one to be replaced was November 1939. And this is one that the shilling value was one of the latest to be replaced. So you see quite a lot of covers in the 37 to 39 period, which are a mixture of both reigns. You don't see quite as many mixed Edward VIII and George VI stamps, oddly enough. I presume that's because the 4 Edward VIII stamps were the same 4 values as the first 4 issued George VI stamps. So basically, they would essentially replacing them. So you don't see them in combination that often. That's an example from June 37 with the penny Edward and the penny halfpenny coronation issue still in use. You do, if you look out for them, very occasionally find combinations with all 3 reigns on a commercial cover. There are lots and lots of philatelic uses of that because obviously philatelists noticing that there were 3 stamps issued in the same year or current in the same year for 3 different kings naturally jumped at the chance to put them on cover. That one's from a bank though to a firm in Holland, so I presume it's just what they happen to have on the in the post room. You do find them, but not often. I think I've got about half a dozen triple reign things that look reasonably commercial. So that's a thing to look out for if you're interested in mixed frankings. You can also get mixed frankings within the reign. So Again, the commemoratives replace the definitives, so it's not that usual to find them used for the same value on the same cover. And you also get the low values having the different colours issued during the war because of the to save ink. That's on a little printed letter sheet for the Life Association of Scotland. So it does actually appear to be commercial use. And you also get the same thing with the high values where they change the 2 and 6penny to from brown to green because the brown ink was hard to get hold of in wartime conditions. That's one of my favourite covers. I mean, it's large and it's got folds in it and it looks a bit battered, but it sort of comes under the heading of, okay, find me another. I think that will be quite difficult to do. And of course you get mixed Frankings with the QE2. That's the first stamp of the new reign, on a reused envelope with the stamp it was succeeding. Again, the coronation commemorative came out before the wildings, and again you get wildings gradually replacing the George VI issues over the 3-year period between late 52 and late 55. And you also had a few booklets that were issued with mixed reign contents. They weren't Citenant panes, they were panes of Wildings and panes of George VI stamps. But all 3 stamps on that postcard have got the trimmed perforations you normally associate with booklet stamps. So I suspect they probably came out the same booklet, which is a nice little thing to find on a mixed ranking. Next few pages, just having a look at some of the possibilities for the various services you can have other than just letterpost. Printed papers are quite light because you often get quite attractive items, and that's a nice little advertising cover there. Or you can find rare rates. That penny blue stamp was only available for use for the printed papers rate for about a month before they put the rate up. And you can, again, that's a nice commercial first aid cover. And one thing I like about printed paper, you can often find really odd things going as printed papers. That's a copy of a marriage certificate that was, it's some peculiar type of marriage certificate, which I'm going to have to look at the page for, and notice of marriage by certificate without license, which I didn't know you could do, but obviously somebody's ordered a copy of that and just stuck a stamp on it and sent it through the post. Commercial papers that was a thing available only in the overseas post. That was things like, well, legal documents, invoices, book manuscripts, things that were partly or even mostly handwritten or drawn, because you'd have plans, for example, as part of it. But they could go at the lower rate, although there was a minimum rate of, in this case, 4p, as you can see, for this kind of item. Not hard, not easy to find those, so it's nice when you can come across one. And there was also reduced rates for newspapers as opposed to just ordinary printed papers. So again, you find these. That's a piece cut out from a wrapper, which is fine, I would say. With things like large packets and parcels, you often find those pieces, and that's probably good, because if you had the whole wrapper, it would be quite hard to mount. Sample post is another obscure one that well worth looking out for. There were inland versions, and again, these things often have nice printing on them to show what's going on. I mean, that's somebody sending a sample of Hawaiian coffee to Stockholm. And you also have an Airmail version of it. That's a rather strange solo use. Zone A is quite hard to find as a destination. Samples is quite hard to find as a destination as well. So a double rate Airmail samples to Zone A is, again, probably quite an unusual thing. So I was quite pleased to get that one. few other services for overseas trade are well worth looking out for. Small packets, you wouldn't think that was a hard thing to find, but for some reason they really are. Probably, I mean, the idea of a small packet was to send dutiable goods, so I suppose the wrapping didn't tend to survive. That's one. Selfridge is sent between branches. It's glass sent for matching only. You also, of course, get the parcel post, and again, these tend to be like large labels with quite nice frankings on, so that's all to the good. And there also was an air parcel post. Air parcels got suspended in '39 because the just wasn't the air capacity to carry them. But it took a while after the war before they restarted. But in '49, they restarted again. That's a reasonably early one from a publishing company to Belgium. So presumably had books of some kind in it. Late fees is an area that if anybody wants to get into, because they would be well worth researching, because they stopped printing the details of late fees in the post office guides in the late 1930s. So when you get things like that from 1940, it's quite a thing to find. Basically, at that stage, the post office guide just said, see your local post office for details if they're doing late fees. Glasgow obviously were, even in 1940. There was also a standard late fee of a halfpenny for posting on a TPO. That's a large packet, which is slightly battered, but I quite like large packets because they show a side of the post that collectors don't always show. And that's a nice example there with threepence halfpenny postage and halfpenny late fee. And you also had special registration late fees, which is a registered mail collector, is one of my little sidelines. Quite like that one because it's threepence registration, twopence halfpenny postage, and twopence late fee, all paid with a stamp of a particular value. You can also have non-postal usages, and I'm rapidly skimming on that. That's NHS prescription charges. The doctor took the money in and accounted for it by signing off postage stamps. That's a common use, you see, which is the receipt tax, which lasted up until about 1970. And whether that counts as non-postal or not is up to you. It's not going through the post, it's the charges for telegrams. They were meant to be thrown away, but batches of them tend to have got out, so you can find these complete forms with the message still on and the count of words and the stamps all over them to pay. With George VI period, obviously the main historical feature of the reign is that it was the wartime reign. So one thing you can collect, or probably should note in the when you're writing things up, is the effects of World War II. There are some things where you look at the early pre-war stuff. There are states and countries that no longer existed after the war, or didn't come back until much later. So, for example, the Free City of Danzig, which was lasted from 1920 to 1939 as a separate state, but then was incorporated into Germany and became part of Poland as Gdansk in 1945. But in 1937, which is when that cover is, it was a separate destination. Latvia, which was again a country in the between wars period, but not too long after this letter was sent, it was forcibly incorporated in the USSR and didn't get its independence again for another 50 years. And historical obscurities like the Slovakia, the first Slovak Republic, which was broken off after Czechoslovakia was dismembered post-Munich conference. It was basically a Nazi client state. It was, I think, the only one that joined Germany and Russia, Germany and the Soviet Union in invading Poland. But it lasted for 39 to 45, so there's a very short period when you can find mail from GB actually going there. You get odd things when you see wartime mail to states, you think, hang on, weren't they involved in the war? Well, not always. Italy, for example, you think of Italy as one of the main Axis powers, but they didn't actually declare war on the UK and France until it looked fairly clear that France was about to collapse. So as late as May 1940, when the invasion of France is well underway, you still get letters going to Italy. Yugoslavia, again, you could get mail through to Yugoslavia until that was invaded. Although, as you see there, that's one that's been sent back as no service. That wasn't until April, and the date on there is February. But the route to Yugoslavia was a very long-winded one. You had to go all the way around Africa and then back up again to Egypt and then overland, which is why you got a cover to Yugoslavia saying Egyptian censorship. And also a place like Bulgaria, which managed to stay, though it was linked with the Axis, it managed to stay neutral till March 1941. So you can still find covers going to it. A lot of services got suspended because of the war, obviously. You can find a large number in Germany was the obvious one. That's letter posted on the 1st of September, war declared on the 3rd of September, so it hadn't got to Germany in time before that became impossible. Places like Luxembourg, which were occupied. And of course, when Japan entered the war, places like Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, you also find these no-service things. Mail to neutral countries was often quite tricky. So that's, if you wanted to send goods to a neutral country, you needed an export permit, and this label you got stuck on there. And actually getting access to them would be quite hard. That's a letter that was sent surface route to Sweden, but got sent back with a thing saying no service except by air at the time. So they put an extra 5 stamps on to make it up. And censorship obviously delayed things quite a lot, especially if you were going to places like Switzerland in the middle of Europe. So you got caught up in both the Allied censorship and the German censorship. There's a sort of blue stripes on the back of that card where they were testing for secret writing. On the home front, one thing that affected post specifically was paper shortages. There was a wartime paper control. So you see things going on that's designed to cope with that. For example, you've got a return of popularity for letter sheets. That's where you don't have an envelope, you just write or print on the sheet and fold it up and send it. You're also encouraged to reuse envelopes where possible. Usually it's once or twice, but occasionally you get things like that where somebody's actually gone completely mad and reused the same envelope about a dozen times. There's another couple of stamps on the back of that one. And even after the war, you get things like this, because paper was still hard to find. If you're wondering what those sort of funny squiggly lines on that, it looks like it's got water stains or something. Actually, no. If you fold back the flap, the envelope actually been made from paper that had a maps printed on it. It's a map of France, so I suspect it was a military surplus thing from the from D-Day era. Right. Hoping I'm not going to take too long now. So Airmail is obviously, if you're interested in airmail as a topic, or you're a keen airmail collector, the wartime airmail services are a rich field for you to dive into, because it made a huge difference. Before the war, the Imperial Services were connected, going across land to a certain extent, but they were gradually connected up with air services. So, I mean, that's a typical example to Ceylon, where sixpence was typically the rate. In the 37 to 39 period, they were rolling out what was called the Empire Airmail scheme, which was the idea that all first step rate mail to the Empire would go at what would normally be the surface rate, or the same as the inland letter rate. That's an example going to Iraq, which you wouldn't think of as being part of the British Empire, but it was on the route, and it was under British mandate, or I don't think it was actually under a mandate, was it? But it was under British influence, so it was treated as an Empire destination. But obviously the war put pay to that. If you want to do an air route, it's basically a case of, find any route you can. That's a letter to China, and it went by what a lot of things were going to, by the two ocean route, i.e. instead of going east, you started out going west by airmail to America, across the Atlantic, and then flew across America by internal air services, put it on the Pan Am services across Trans-Pacific, and flew it that way. That was expensive, 5 bob per half ounce. You could send it by the Imperial routes. It was only 1 sixpence, but a lot of the time you were going by sea, and again you were sort of going round Africa up to Egypt, down round the Cape up to Egypt again, and at that point, if you were lucky, you managed to get it on a plane. So that took 64 days in transit. And I suspect because of that, most of the time it was probably on a ship rather than actually on a plane. It got so bad. I mean, that's going on to Beirut. That one is, they put a mark on saying, please inform sender airmail service not available. If you look in the post office circular, it basically just says, don't bother paying for airmail because it doesn't offer any advantage any longer. So that's paid at the surface rate. A quick thing to show as I say, it's quite complicated, and depending on which area of the world you talk about airmail to. So a quick series of slides just to show airmail to South America, which gets most of the gist of it things in. That started out as links with the French or German services, and those are the two examples there. You can tell the difference between the two because they weren't. I think they were both twice a week, but on different days, or once a week, but on different days, twice a week overall. You can tell which one it went on because the German service have the this nice red or magenta mark, Deutsche Luftpost, and you could even send second-class airmail to some of the countries. Early World War II, obviously the German service wasn't going to be longer available. So after a short break, the French service came back, but that was now 5 bob per half ounce to most places. So you got covers like that, which were somewhere between 2.5 and 3 ounces, but you're paying 30 shillings, which was, so if you were sending something at that sort of rate, it would have to be pretty important. Although you could also send commercial papers again and samples at quarter of the usual rates to certain places, and that's a nice little 5 bob solo to Argentina. Obviously after the fall of France, the French services were no longer available, but there was an alternative which came in 39, which was to use the American services, either transatlantic air mail, then down by Pan Am, going down the American route, or you could send it by sea to New York first. And again, these are quite expensive, 3 and 6pence was a typical route to the most of South America. The countries in the north of the continent, it was slightly cheaper. Or you could have that, which was it was less by the amount of the airmail rate from Britain to the USA. So that went by sea to New York and then down the continent to Brazil. I suspect, actually, given the circuitous routes and the effects of censorship, it wasn't as slow as you would think it is by comparison with the air all the way. So it probably wasn't a bad bargain. Post-war, the rates got reduced slightly in 45, and then in 46, the British South American Airway, Britain tried to get into the act with their own service. So the British South American Airways stuff come at an even cheaper rate from 1946. That's quite a hefty one that paid the rate for up to 6 ounces. And again, it's a large cover, but it's plastered with stamps, and I think it looks nice. In 1947, airmail got drastically simplified. Basically, everywhere outside of Europe got grouped by geographical zone rather than by the air route it was taken or the air carrier. So Zone A was North Africa and the Middle East. And actually, because North Africa and the Middle East wasn't a huge destination for GB UK mail, it tends to be quite hard to find the Zone A rates. Zone C was the Far East and Australasia after 1948, which I'll come back to on the next slide, which tends to be rather easier to find, especially if you're going to Australia. Mail to Japan and China, for example, tends to be harder to find. And there was a postcard rate, you'll notice, which was half the usual rate. And Zone B was everywhere else. It's much the commonest rate to find. So it's basically everywhere else outside of Europe. A few countries changed zones. The original Zone C included a few countries in the West Indies and South America. So Jamaica is one, for example. That's a Zone C rate. It moved to Zone B, they all moved to Zone B in May 48. So that's the next period, but the cheaper rate. And you had the occasional oddity like Cyprus, which was stuck into Zone A originally for some reason I don't know. It wasn't treated as a European destination until 1971. So if you're wondering why you get covers of Cyprus with 6pence on them rather than the cheaper European rate, that's why. Obviously, we're glad to know we're coming to the last few slides. Obviously, if you're looking at George VI mail, Forces mail is going to be a big part of that. It's actually, if you're looking for a topic to dive into, the Forces rates tend to be obscure. There's not a lot of documentation on them. Not a lot's been written on them or found out. On the GBPS website, there will hopefully soon be a sort of rough draft of some of the rates, but there's still plenty of things to dive into there. Forces mail, the penny halfpenny rate stayed in force of the forces on active service when the rates went up in 1940. Mail from the forces was usually free unless you paid airmail. So, I mean, that, for example, is a honour envelope with the airmail fee of 10pence paid, which was still cheaper than the usual airmail rate because the surface part of it was included free. And there are even things like special rates. This was a sort of precursor to airgraphs. It was an airmail postcard service to certain commands, for example, East Africa Force. You also get Allied forces using GB stamps, which is an interesting little sideline to look at. So that's the Norwegian Field Post Office there, up in Scotland, if I remember rightly. The US forces, obviously. That's from one of the the fake units that were set up to try and confuse the German intelligence. It's the PSYOPs unit. Czech forces, little wrapper band there, and you occasionally get things like Allied forces on who are active duty rather than stationed in the UK. That's a Free French forces in Egypt with plastered with threatening stamps on. Post-World War II operations, forces, plenty of things going on there. So you got like mail from the army on the Rhine. You get mail from the Korean War at the end of the reign. That's actually shows you how much rationing was still going on in the UK, because that's a food parcel sent home from the forces to the UK, which is, you would think, is the wrong way around, but wasn't. And you also get, I mean, things which don't look quite so good in historical retrospective. So you get the Imperial forces in places like Kenya for the Mau Mau uprising. And finally, last set of covers, a few examples of used abroad that aren't military or Packe mail. Well, okay, this one looks like it's military, but it's a civilian cover. The Australian APO 214 stationed in Tokyo, you could post civilian mail at it, and they had British stamps as well as Australian. So you got this is a British stamps used at Australian Army post office in Japan going to Hong Kong, which is quite a strange little combination there. Again, I've been trying to find out what rates they were using for this. It's not been easy to find. If anybody has any idea, that's something you can tell me. You also had the British post offices abroad, in Morocco, for example, Tangier. You could use British stamps as well as the overprinted ones. And you also had oddities like that where American diplomatic mail was cancelled in Washington but used the stamps of the host country. So that's been a sort of whistle-stop tour of the King George VI period. Large number of things I would have liked to include but didn't have time for. If you enjoyed this talk, I can only recommend that you consider joining the GBPS, because gets lots of stuff and all sorts of things to do with GB. As Howard said yesterday, the bargain price of 25 quid a year if you're in the UK, and not that much more if you're abroad. So if you enjoyed any of these talks, please do join it. And with that, I will hand back to our host.
Thank you, Maurice. That was so comprehensive, so much material there. We've got a few questions. I just wanted to ask, how did that collection begin? And have you kind of developed how you approach it now, and what items you're looking for?
How did it begin? I thought I was mostly collecting postal history just for standard postal history. So I thought, okay, I'll do something that's more focused on the stamps. So it started out as trying to get as many different usages for each stamp as possible. Inevitably, it sort of turned into a more general thing, with looking at the rates and the forces mail and stuff like that. But it's still trying to look at the as much as possible how the stamps were used, which is an area that's tends to be not well explored in GB philately. So there's actually quite plenty of scope for people to look at new things there.
So do you, are there certain aspects or certain parts of the collection that you're still, looking to fill, or looking for particular examples?
Oh, good grief! I mean, I try to get covers to each rate and maybe each country you could go to, and some of the countries tend to be extremely hard to find mail to. So if you're looking for some tiny island in the Pacific, whatever, you just any cover to them at all, you either stumble across it or you don't. I try to I try to get different combinations of the same thing where I can. So, but again, it tends to be what comes up, and I mean, most of the stuff, strangely enough, turns up on eBay or Del Camp. Dealers are starting to get into this stuff now as more people are getting into it. But for a long while, you could have your pick of this stuff at really very cheap prices, and it's still yeah, not tends to be not that expensive compared to comparable material from countries that have really got into usage collecting, like USA or Australia, for example.
Yeah.
Prices can be quite spectacular.
Interesting. So there's some scope there for people who want to kind of start.
There's a lot of scope in both in this reign and in George V and QE2 stamps. I know some people are collecting those as diving into the area and seeing what you can find. So if you want a nice open-ended subject, then that's the usage of stamps as opposed to the just the stamps themselves as artifacts is an area that's going to offer lots of potential and chance to find rare things at low prices, which is always a nice thing for any collector.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Okay, we've got a question from Lloyd who says, do you find the best source of high value usage from banks and tobacco merchants from the Channel Islands, or are there others that you can recommend? Quite a specific question.
Weirdly, and I know what he's talking about. He's talking about the parcel post labels. Weirdly enough, I've not been able to get hold of one of those labels. I suspect possibly Max Melrose has cornered the market in them. He's got quite a number of them. They tend to be more readily available for earlier reigns than George VI, I think. Most of the high value stuff tends to be, it's obviously business mail, but it's no one particular source, I don't think. It's just that if anybody in a mail room kept the covers as opposed to soaking the high value stamps off what are often quite large covers, then you've got the covers. So it's a bit hit and miss, and you sort of saying a word of thanks to some guy in a mail room in America or whatever who hung on to stuff in the 1940s.
Yeah, okay. And we've just got some comments as well. So James Heel, during the presentation, just pointed out there are some very high value parcels used for 35mm film reels going to Hollywood.
Yep,
So that'd be quite interesting.
They're sort of up on a top of a cupboard there, so I didn't actually get them around to scanning them in. But yeah, those are nice things as well to have. It's nice to have it's a lot of these things. You've got the social history as well, which is an interesting thing to have. So
yeah, that's fun. So presumably they're movie studios.
Sorry?
So presumably that's movie studios sending the films.
Yeah, I think there was a batch that came up a few years back. I think it was a newsreel company sending the latest newsreels out to America. There are some similar ones going to Australia, but almost all of those have been cut up for the tempery bright blue stamps. So that's where you get a lot of those off cover that are quite cheaply, but the ones on cover, nobody kept them, so it's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And then Ray Simpson, who is an expert on mixed franking, has pointed out, he just said there's a very impressive 2 and 6 green-brown colour change mixed franking, presumably unbeatable in King George VI era.
I think it would be quite hard to duplicate, yeah. But again, it's one of those things. It turned up in a lot of about 70 George VI covers from a German seller who just bundled them all together into one thing and put them on for a modest price, and the whole lot cost something like 70 quid, and it included a 11 penny plum solo on and a bunch of other things that were useful as well. So, as I say, there's a lot of rare items in this area that you can pick up for not very much. Well, at least you could. I mean, if more people get into it, I suppose it will. The competition will be fiercer, but it's probably a good time to get into it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, before we do too many more presentations to let everyone know about it.
Yes, I know. Yes. Don't. As long as you don't compete with something I want, of course. That's in which case.
Yeah, that's fine. And do you have a particular favourite item? Do you think, if you could pick one?
Ooh, good. I mean, that mixed 2 and 6 liquor is one of my favourites. I do like the 11 penny solo on the parcel post, fragment, because parcel post, again, it tends to be large brown paper wrappers, so people didn't keep them. So it took me quite a while to find. I remember I did an early display of this. It was probably about 15 years ago. No, say about 12 years ago. And I'd shown some of this and was thinking, okay, this is my solo and multiple uses. I'd like to have shown the 11p cover, but it's not likely you're going to find one of those anytime soon. And it was at a stamp fair down in, can't be somewhere in south of where the GBFS were holding a meeting. And I wandered out and took a look at a stall where it was a guy I hadn't seen the stock for a while. Oh, then, one of the first things I saw there is that 11 penny parcel use. So it's like, yep, a few quid, I'll grab that quickly and before anybody else does.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favourite items, I think.
Yeah.
That we actually got tucked into this display.
Excellent. So just one more question. Tony Sharma asked, do you travel after items you hear about?
Probably.
It depends what it is, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, I suppose, stuff like this doesn't turn up as a single lot in a live auction. Occasionally I will go to some of the auctions around here, but mostly you'd be bidding online or putting a book, I suppose. But is that the how far we go to show missing history? Yeah, I mean,
yes,
I mean, again, I'll research it a bit if I can. I mean, there's a site called, if you're looking for details on companies, there's a site called Grace's Guide on the internet, which tries to give as many details as possible as British companies, which is invaluable for looking up random companies that you've never heard of before. And I mean things like, okay, there was a cover from a company called Aitchison that I put in there, which when I looked it up, oh right, it's the guys who provided the graphite for the graphite line stamp in the succeeding reign. So that's
right.
It's a nice little thing to find out and stick right up.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well that's brilliant. We've just got another one. Alexios asks, how difficult would it be to find pre-war airmail parcel items?
Extremely. I've not what I mean. I did an article listing the rates on those for the newsletter, GBPS newsletter, a year or two back. And when I looked, I found I didn't actually have one, mostly because by the start of the George VI reign, they were phasing out the air parcel rates in favour of the all-up air letter rates. So there weren't many places you could actually send an air parcel to with George VI stamped on pre-war.
Right,
By the time war broke out, I think Colombia was more or less the only, a few places in Europe and Colombia, and that was it.
Right, okay.
Parcel wrappers, again, weren't often kept and reasonably intact, so they're hard to find. So if Alexios knows where to find
Yeah, maybe.
I will be delighted to open negotiations for them.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. I've just got another one popped in as well. Yeah, just some comments now, Maurice. So Tony says, thank you, a fantastic diversion to normal collecting. And then in the chat, we've had wonderful display, Maurice. And then Lloyd says, your presentation was so fascinating. And I'm encouraged to look into collecting more postal history from the Three Kings era. Thank you so much.
Yep, can only encourage people to do that. It's an area with a lot of interest in it, I think.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time. It's been another really good session. I'm just so impressed with the collections and the expertise we've seen so far. As you may know, there's another live webinar tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the morning. So do join us for that one. And there's some special offers and other information, and all the talks at allaboutstamps.co.uk. And there's a special section there for the conference where you can see everything. So do come along to the website. So thanks again for everyone for coming along. And Maurice, thank you so much for your time and for sharing that with us. Thank you.
Yeah.